Hello, 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 hello. Oui, oui, mon ami. Good morning. Morning, 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 morning. Morning. Hello. If you were here on the 16th of September 2018, then you were here at the beginning of a journey. It was a journey through the Gospel of John, and it's been a long journey with multiple detours along the way. But we've been, as a church, dipping in and out of the book of John for, well, what's that? That's about 4.5 years or so now. And this term, finally finishing that journey. We have 4 chapters left, and that's what we'll be going over in the lead up to Easter. Now, at this point, you might think a bit like, like like a Saturday afternoon when you turn on the TV and you're like looking what's on, and on like BBC Two, there's a great film, there's a film you love, but it's like, oh, it's 45 minutes in, do I bother watching the rest of it? You might feel a bit like that, right? What I would say to you is actually you've joined at just the right moment. You have come to the moment when everything ramps up. Every single passage has some form of motif or incident or something going on that echoes down literature, that you find repeated time and time again in plays and poems, in series and films. It's a dramatic final part. You are here just in time. So we are going to be looking at John chapter 18. We're going to be starting in verse 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to read a bit. We're going to read a bit of the story, then we're going to think about a bit of the story, read a bit, then we're going to go through it slowly together. So, John chapter 18, starting in verse 1. After Jesus had said these things, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden. Right, let's start again. After Jesus had said these things, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. So, he starts saying after, so let's just get up to speed with where we are in the story, okay? So it's Passover week. So it's this Jewish festival. Thousands and thousands of people are thronging around the city of Jerusalem. And then a night, usually probably a day earlier than usual, Jesus has decided with his disciples to have the Passover feast. This is a meal where through the meal you remember how their ancestors were once slaves in Egypt and how God raised up a man called Moses to lead these people out of slavery and give them freedom again. So they've just had this meal. At the end of the meal, Jesus then prays, and he prays that his disciples would be one, that they would glorify God. And he has this long prayer. And then the prayer finishes. And at this point, what happens is the disciples and Jesus, they leave the city. They probably go out like a westerly or northwestern gate, and they go down, they cross over a brook, a small little stream called the Kidron, the brook of Kidron, and they walk down to this little valley where it flows into, and they walk up out of the valley into a garden. And at this moment, there's something interesting, right? So there's 4 accounts of the life of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And something I find quite interesting is they often tell the same story, but they draw out different details. So, for example, if you read this story in Matthew or Mark, the thing they name in the story is the garden. They call the Garden of Gethsemane. You might have heard of it. But John doesn't name the garden. He wants to name something else, something that none of the other gospel writers do. He names the name of the valley that they walk over to get there, the Kidron Valley. Why does he do this? I think it's to set the scene. See, the Kidron Valley appears 4 times in Scripture before this point. And each of those instances, there's something to do with death. Either it's people running away from death, either it's people dying, or the 2 most common are there was a king over Judah, a guy called Asa, and he goes around, he goes into the temple in Jerusalem, which is meant to be worshipping the God of the Israelites, and he notices there's altars to other gods, and he realizes this isn't right. So he collects it all up, all of this kind of, these little altars and all the wood and idols and little images of these foreign gods in the temple. He gathers them all up, he takes them down into the valley of Kidron, and he burns them, he destroys them. And then a few generations later, there's another king called Josiah. And Josiah, same realization. He goes into the temple, and a few other kings have added altars to foreign gods. And they've built a huge totem pole in the middle, this wooden tower in the middle of the temple to worship a foreign god called Asherah. And you worship him by sacrificing your children there. Right? It's this really horrible thing. And then you look up and you see on top of the temple, they've put all these stone statues to worship foreign gods. And Josiah, in a fit of religious zeal, he gathers it all up and he takes it down into the Kidron Valley, and he builds a huge bonfire and he burns it. Right? And then he goes back and he goes to the top of the temple and he takes these statues, and instead of smashing them or just pushing them off the roof, he said, no, we don't want to destroy them in the temple. We pick them up, they carry them down into the valley of Kidron, and they smash them. It's as if they get sledgehammers and keep smashing them, pounding them until they become pebbles. This valley is a place where divine things, or supposedly powerful spiritual forces, it's where divine things are destroyed. It's where the divine dies. Right? That's what John wants to put out. So what's he doing here? Why is he mentioning this? Well, I think it's a bit like an action film, right? You know, like the classic kind of, someone gets kidnapped and they demand a ransom, right? And then there's a scene where they're meant to like exchange the money for the person or something. And that never, ever happens in, like, I don't know, a kid's birthday party at a bowling alley or McDonald's. It never happens anywhere kind of like fun or lively. It's always something like a disused warehouse on the edge of town on a cold, rainy, lightning-filled night, right? It's never like, it's always a dark place. John is setting the scene here. He's saying something dark's going. He's putting you on your haunches. You're kind of, what's going to happen? Verse 2, Judas, who betrayed Jesus, also knew the place because Jesus often met with his disciples there. So Judas took a company of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees and came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. So what's happened? Earlier in that week, Jesus has been in Jerusalem, and the religious leaders aren't particularly happy with Jesus. See, Jesus has been teaching people, and people go, hang on a second, what he says makes more sense than what the religious leaders say. What he says has authority, theirs doesn't seem to. And then Jesus goes on and he heals people, and the people are like, hang on a second, he's got authority not just in his words, but in his deeds, unlike these religious leaders, and the religious leaders don't like this. And then Jesus starts saying things which the religious leaders seem to think, is he saying he's God or related to God? And they don't like this. If Jesus is saying he's God and he's not God, he's doing something called blasphemy, where the punishment for that is death. And so these religious leaders, they decide they want to kill Jesus. But there's a problem. Jesus has got a large following, so they don't want to go and arrest him in the temple when everyone's there because they're scared there might be a riot or a revolt or something. So what they do is they think we'll arrest him when no one else is around. But we don't know where he'll be. So they pay one of Jesus' followers, Judas, and they say, lead us at an opportune moment when everything's quiet to find him and we can arrest him in secret. And this is the scene, right? Earlier in the night, they're having the meal. Jesus says, someone's going to betray me. He says, whoever it is, go do it. Judas leaves. He goes, finds these chief priests. He says, this is the moment. This is the moment you're waiting for. This is the moment, right? And they gather together some soldiers and they go marching to this garden. And just imagine yourself as Jesus for a moment. You can hear the soldiers' feet. You can hear the clinking of their swords against their armor. You can see the lanterns coming up the hillside. And they finally come into the garden, and you see, stood amongst these men who you kind of figured out already are going to arrest you. You see Judas. You see a man who has spent the last 3 years going wherever you go. You've shared everything you have with him. He's slept under the same stars with you. He's eaten the same meals. He's stayed in the same homes. You have loved him. You have shared everything with him. and you see him stood before you with a retinue of soldiers, how would you feel? That betrayal. A betrayal gnaws away at you, right? Last 2 weeks, right? If you've turned on the TV, like the top story in the news, for some inexplicable reason, has been a man who feels he's betrayed by his brother and his father. And he's revealing all these intimate details. And everyone's going, why are you doing this? It's because he has this sense that he has been betrayed, right? And betrayal leads you to do odd things. It leads you, maybe you try and hide. Maybe you run away. Maybe you just want to escape the situation. Maybe you lash out and you get violent. Maybe you try and just avoid it and just bury your head in the sand, but it does something to you. It does something to you, betrayal. That's what it does. If you were Jesus, what would you do? It's the dark, it's the night. Would you try to run away? Would you turn violent? What would you do? What does Jesus do? Verse 4. Then Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen to him, went out and said to them, who is it that you're seeking? They say, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus says, I am he. He doesn't go, it's that guy over there. It's not me. People sometimes call me that, but that's not my name. My name's actually Brian. And then just kind of walks off slowly through. No, he doesn't do that. It's me. And he doesn't get violent, doesn't try to run away. He just stands there. Who is it that you're seeking? Jesus of Nazareth, they answer. I am he. Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing with them. When Jesus told them, I am he, they stepped back and fell to the ground. That's weird. That's weird. When was the last time, like, I don't know if you've ever been in this sort of situation, right? You need to find someone, you don't know what they look like. So you go into and you say, I'm looking for Brian, right? And then the person says, oh, that's me. Have you ever, in response to them, fallen on the ground startled? Like you don't do that. Right? That's just odd. So what's going on here? Remember, this is Passover week. This is the week that you remember how your ancestors were slaves in Egypt and are now free. And they're because God raised up a man called Moses. Right, Moses has this encounter. He's not in Egypt. He's in the wilderness. He's a shepherd, and he's walking around. And he ends up walking into a cave, and in the cave he sees a bush, which is odd, and the bush is on fire, which is odd, and the bush isn't getting any smaller, which is odd, and then the bush starts speaking to him, which is odd. And what does the bush say? This booming voice. It tells him to go to Egypt. And when Moses is like, who are you? What is this voice? Who are you? The response, God speaking to him in that moment is, I am that I am. And when Moses says, okay, cool, I'm happy to go to Egypt, but when they ask me, who do I say sent me? And he says, God says to him, tell them that I am has sent you. When God gives himself a name, the name he gives himself is I am. And so we go back into the garden. Who is it that you're seeking? Jesus of Nazareth. I am he. They come to arrest him because he's claiming to be God. And all of a sudden they're a bit shocked, right? They're like, hang on a second, you're not meant to, that's not what you say. But more than that, there's something to be some power in his voice. Something which causes them to be startled. And again, you think, they're on the ground, right? You've just been betrayed. They're on the ground, right? Kick them while they're down. Run away. You've got a moment. You've got a chance. You've got a window of opportunity here, Jesus. What are you going to do? So what does Jesus do? Verse 7. Then he asked them again, who is it that you're seeking? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. I told you, I am he. Jesus doubles down. Jesus replied, so if you're looking at me, let these men go. So what seems to have happened is, whilst this conversation's been happening, some of the other soldiers have started circling around and arresting the other disciples. And Jesus is like, look, you're not looking for them, you're looking for me, so take me, arrest me, don't arrest them. This was to fulfill the words he had said, I have not lost one of those you have given me. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Peter has a disagreement on how to deal with this betrayal. He thinks violent revolution. But also, like, it's not violent, it's inept violent revolution, right? So there's a couple of reasons for this. The first one is he decides to get a sword out, and instead of striking, I don't know, a soldier, he strikes a servant. But then also, in Greek, that word sword, it's a specific type of Roman dagger you use to stab someone. And he manages to cut the guy's ear off. So either he's slicing, so he doesn't know how to use the sword, and that's how he's done. Or he's trying to stab the guy in the face, and he's just inept, right? It's just not working for him. And then it says the servant's name was Malchus. Why would John name the servant? I think it's because in the other gospel accounts, what happens next is Jesus actually takes the time to heal this servant. He restores the guy's ear. And my bet would probably be that John is saying, there's this guy Malchus has happened to, and he's probably still alive. So maybe go and speak to Malchus, and he can tell you that what I've said is true. It's like a little footnote. Just be like, you can put that to the side for a second. What's Jesus' response to this inept revolution? Verse 11, at that, Jesus said to Peter, put your sword away. Am I not to drink the cup my Father has given me? Am I not to give that? That's a weird thing to say. Am I not to drink the cup my Father? What's this cup about, right? What's going on here? What's this cup? Am I not to drink the cup my Father has given me? He doesn't want Peter to fight because there's something Jesus has on his mind. He wants to drink a cup. What is this cup? What is this cup? Well, there is a cup referenced a few times in the Old Testament, a few times in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, and also in a psalm, Psalm 75. Psalm 75, verse 7 says, for God is the judge. He brings down one, exalts another. For there is a cup in the Lord's hand, full of blended with spices, and he pours from it. All the wicked of the earth will drink, draining it to its dregs. In Isaiah, it sounds like it bubbles, and it causes people to stagger, and they lose control of themselves, and they end up kind of lying immobile, as it were, dead on the floor. And no one wants to drink it. See, you hear wine with spices, right? And you think, mulled wine, that's Christmas, that's all good, right? But it's not that. What he's trying to evoke, the psalmist is trying to evoke this image of basically like a witch's cauldron condensed down into a poisoned chalice. That's the image. And it's the sort of thing which you don't want to drink. It's not the sort of drink you take a sip of and go, that's not nice, I'll leave it. It's the sort of thing where you're like, I never want to go near this. This is steaming and bubbling. This isn't spiced, this is spiked. This is bad for me. And the sense is that those who have done wicked and evil things will be forced to drink it. They cannot say no, and they will drain it to its dregs. They will drink the whole of this cup, whether they like it or not. It's this horrible image. It's this image of the punishment God has. Often, this is called the cup of the wrath of God. And we go, that sounds really horrible. I thought God was meant to be a loving God. How do we square that? Let me put it like this. Over the last few years, there's been an ever-broadening conversation in our society about issues of racial injustice. Now, a loving response to those who have been on the short end of racial injustice is not to not do anything about it. It is to seek justice. To seek justice is a loving thing to do, right? And there is this sense in which God is a God who is just. God is a God who is loving. And therefore, he must punish what is wrong. And at this moment, you realize that there's this sense in which we have all done what is wrong. We all are those who should be drinking this cup, who should be draining it to its dregs, and it will make us stagger, and it will make us fall, and it will not be nice for us, for all of us have done things that are wrong to others, to the created world that God made, or to God himself. There's this sense in which this is the cup that we are to drink. And Jesus says, am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me? Am I not to drink it? Jesus wants to drink that cup. And this is startling and odd because you read all the accounts of the life of Jesus and there's never one moment, there's never one instance when you point at it and go, hang on a second, I think, Jesus, you're being immoral here. You look at it and you go, you're not the person to drink this cup. This isn't the cup that's meant for you. But you see throughout this passage, throughout this story, how intent he is to drink it all the time, every moment. Think about it, earlier in the night, they're having the meal. And Jesus says, one of you will betray me. Whoever it is, go do it now. He encourages his betrayer to go and betray him. And then think about it, he finishes praying. And then they decide that they're going to go to a garden. Now, around Jerusalem, there are lots of gardens. Which is the one Jesus decides to go to? It's the one he knows Judas knows about. It's the one he knows Judas goes to with him. So he goes to the place where Judas is most likely to go. And then what happens is all these guards start appearing, right? And then in verse 4, it says Jesus went out to them. So the disciples are stood in this little gaggle, right? An indiscriminate gaggle. And then Jesus steps out from it. He doesn't hide away, he steps out. And then notice, standing face to face with the guard doesn't say anything. Jesus initiates the conversation. Who is it that you're seeking? They say Jesus. Jesus goes, that's me. They get startled and stunned. There's a moment, the window of opportunity. Does Jesus take it? No. He's like, we're doing something here, guys. We're in the middle of something. Let's keep this going. Who are you looking for? They repeat, Jesus. He says, that's me. They start arresting everyone else. He's like, don't arrest them, arrest me. Take me. I want to be arrested. Peter's like, violent revolution time. And Jesus is like, no, we're doing this. I'm being arrested tonight. I want to drink this cup. That's what's going on. Why does he want to drink it? It's because he wants to do an exchange of cups. Because whilst this story, Jesus may only reference one cup, that night there are 2 cups in the book of John. There's 2 cups. I said it's a Passover night. During a Passover meal, you drink 4 cups, and each one is meant to be full of wine and overflowing. They're meant to be excessive in their generosity, and they're all. Each of them is meant to remind you of something about what God did to free his people from slavery in Egypt. One is about how God chose a people. It's the cup of sanctification. How he chose a people and made them holy. One is a cup of deliverance, about how he took some people who were slaves and made them not slaves. One is a cup of praise where you say thanks to God. And there's another cup. A cup that you have just after you've finished eating. It's the only cup that John talks about in his account of that night. He says, after the meal, Jesus took a cup. It's the cup. What's the name of that cup? The name of that cup is the cup of redemption. It's to remind you of how God takes people of low status, people who have a judgment over their lives, people who are slaves, and he restores to them another status. He redeems them. He makes them free. He makes them innocent. He removes from them the status that had been placed over them and gives them a new and better status. That is the cup of redemption. That's what it signifies. And Jesus takes that cup. And he says, this is the cup, this cup is my blood. Drink of it and often, and you think of me. This is the blood of a new covenant. And then what does he do with it? He passes it to his disciples. See, Jesus is saying that night, I give you a cup. I give you a cup of redemption, and I will take from you a cup of wrath, a cup of judgment. I will give you a cup you do not deserve and take from you the cup you do deserve. I will take from you a cup which will make you diminish and stagger and die, and I will give to you a cup that is bountiful and overflowing in life and in love and in joy. That is what Jesus is doing that night. It is an exchange of cups. And do you see how intent he is to do this? Whether it's sending someone away to betray him, whether it's approaching the guards, whether it's encouraging them to keep arresting him, to arrest me, not them, to stop the revolution. He wants this to happen. Why? Because he loves us. Because he loves us. He does not want us to see wrath. He wants us to see redemption. He wants us to feel free. He wants us to know what it is to not be sitting under the judgment of God, but to be sat under the love of God. To not be slaves, but to be free. And we've all fallen short. and yet we don't receive what we should. So when does Jesus drink this cup? He drinks this cup as he dies upon the cross, and he drains it to its dregs, and he suffers and dies. But this story doesn't end there. And there's a little hint of it, a little glint, something which very closely, at the beginning of this passage, I said that John is setting the scene. John sets the scene, right? He talks about the Kidron Valley, this place where things die. Where things die, where divine things die. You notice that? And in this passage, Jesus goes, I am he. He makes this kind of claim of divinity, as it were. There's this glint in this kind of image, but Jesus will go down into death. He will be a divine thing that dies. But notice in this passage, Jesus doesn't stay in the valley of Kidron. He goes down into the depths of it. He goes down into the valley of Kidron, but he doesn't stay there because he walks on up out into a garden. See, we see Jesus in his death. We see him descend, as it were, into the valley of Kidron, down into the depths of hell, down into the depths of the abyss below. But he does not stay there. He comes on out. He passes through. He's drained that cup of the wrath of God to its dregs, but that does not defeat him, for he can overcome it, and he comes on out the other side. Which gives us an assurance that we don't need to worry about anything in the future that we do, for Jesus drained that cup to its dregs. This morning we're doing baptisms, right? In baptisms, we signify how that in that life of that individual believer, they have descended down into the depths with Jesus. Jesus has done something for them. He goes down, as they go down into the water, as they're submerged in the water, it's as if they're going down into the valley of Kidron. It's like they're going down into the depths. It's they're going down into the death of Jesus. But we don't leave them to drown under there, do we? We lift them on out. Just as Jesus walks on through the valley of Kidron, just as Jesus dies on the cross and then goes down into the tomb and then comes out a few days later. This is good news. This is joyous news. This is wonderful. Does the band want to come back up? In this passage, we see how Jesus' face was set. We see how much he loves us. We see how we no longer need to live under shame or guilt or fear, for he has done something wonderful for us. Should we stand? Should we stand? Let's pray. Father, I thank you. I thank you. I thank you that Jesus willingly took that cup, that he chose to go to the cross for us, to make that exchange, to take away the cup that we should have been drinking, that cup of wrath, and instead replaced it with a cup of redemption, that we may have a new status, that whatever we have done in our lives, however awful or wrong, you have taken that from us. And Jesus paid the price, and he drained that cup to its dregs. And instead, we receive the bountiful overflow of a loving God, that we may know peace with you. We may know peace in life. You are a wonderful, almighty, loving, joyous God.